In this episode of Forensic Files, we will be discussing the case of Thomas McGowan. McGowan was wrongly convicted of sexual assault and burglary, which led to him spending over 20 years in prison. With the help of the Innocence Project, McGowan became a free man before he passed away in August of 2020. It was the middle of the day on Tuesday, May 7th, 1985, in Richardson, Texas. A woman returned home after running errands to find that her front door was slightly open and there were pry marks on it. She slowly opens the door, only to find her television on the floor. Shortly after she walks in, she gets attacked by a man in her own house. He proceeded to beat her severely and then threatened her with a knife. He made her undress herself and then tied a rope around her face and mouth. After this, he put a glove on, presumably to avoid leaving fingerprints, and tied her hands with his belt. He then proceeded to sexually assault her. After the suspect did all this, he made himself at home, grabbed a beer from her fridge, proceeded to drink it, and then fled from the scene. After calling 911, the victim immediately went to the hospital and a doctor treated her and took semen samples from her body. This was the only evidence left behind, besides the victim's eyewitness testimony. With this being a sexual assault case, the victim chose not to be in the public light, meaning there is very little information on her. However, her story of May 7th, 1985 was released after McGowan left prison. The victim's name has been hidden to the public, but her story of that day is given with the pseudonym Debbie Jones. On the day the attack took place, Debbie Jones was 19 years old and was living with her sister in a townhome in Richardson, Texas. The last thing she had to do before leaving to attend the University of North Texas with her boyfriend was sell her Cutlass Supreme. After she sold the vehicle to an older gentleman that morning, he drove her home and they arrived at her townhome sometime around 11 a.m. He had asked her if he wanted her to walk her to the door, but she thought that was weird and respectfully declined. The suspect, Thomas McGowan, was chosen to be put in the lineup because he matched the description that the victim gave of a 5'10" African American male. His mugshot was put into the second photo lineup that she saw, and he was one of the 3 mugshots that had Richardson Police Department placards in them. However, the crime that he committed to earn that mugshot was not a violent crime. He violated a traffic law, which ended up leaving him in jail for 1 night. Other than this coincidence, he has no connection to the victim at all. There were no other suspects except for the several men that were in the 2 photo lineups. McGowan was tried separately for aggravated sexual assault and burglary. He was tried for burglary first, and on December 7th, 1985, he was found guilty. He was then later tried for the aggravated sexual assault charge, and on March 4th, 1986, he was found guilty yet again. The main piece of evidence used to convict Mr. McGowan in both of these crimes was the victim's eyewitness testimony. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, and they have to be served consecutively. In the original trials, forensic DNA testing was not a procedure that was used at this time in the United States. This is what ultimately sent McGowan to prison. Right after he was convicted of both sexual assault and burglary, McGowan filed for an appeal. However, his appeals were immediately denied. McGowan then spent many years in prison until he discovered the Innocence Project. He applied for the Innocence Project in 2007. After they went over his case, they agreed to help him and push for the DNA to be tested. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office worked side by side with the Innocence Project to gather the information to test. In 2008, the DNA found at the crime scene was tested against McGowan's and was found not to be a match. McGowan was released from prison after this. He was released from prison on April 16, 2008, and on June 11, 2008, he was granted his writ of habeas corpus, making his exoneration official. McGowan spent 23 years in prison, almost half of his life, at his release date. After McGowan was released, he went to live with some family in Richardson, Texas, and he was compensated with $1.8 million. The victim was at the police station looking at a lineup of 7 different pictures. Out of these 7 pictures, 3 were in black and white, while 4 were mugshots that were in color. Of the 4 mugshots in color, 3 of them had a Richardson Police Department placard, while only 1 of them had a Garland Police Department placard. The crime took place in Richardson, so, naturally, the victim paid special attention to these 3 photographs. She said she was unsure about McGowan, but the officer told her it had to be a yes or no answer, and she had to be completely sure. Even though she was unsure, she said that it was definitely McGowan. Even though DNA was found at the crime scene, the victim's witness testimony was used as the key piece of evidence in the trial, because forensic DNA testing was not a widely used thing at the time, especially in the United States. I believe that the victim felt pressured by the police, meaning she had to pick somebody no matter if it was a real perpetrator or not. I believe that the police did their jobs with the DNA testing because there was not much they could do at the time. The first criminal case in the United States that used forensic DNA testing was in 1987, only a year after McGowan's cases. However, I wish that the lineup process was more unbiased and didn't make the victim lean certain ways. I also believe that DNA is 90 to 95% reliable to use in court. Unless you are an identical twin, your DNA is completely unique, meaning that it is one of the most ideal things to test for in a forensic crime that will lead you to a suspect. Not having the DNA tested, in this case, hurt both the prosecution and the defense. Because of cases like this one, I'm glad that technology has increased over the years. If we were still stuck in the 80s and forensic DNA testing was not quite a thing yet, hundreds of people would still be wrongly incarcerated while the real criminals walk the streets. I'm not saying that we're perfect now, but we're certainly improving, and I'm very glad that we can go back and fix past cases of people who have been wrongly imprisoned.